A very warm good afternoon to one and all present here. I'm ML Shankar Karmugilan, Assistant Professor of Law from Tamil Nadu National University. I welcome you all to the third plenary session of the 7th International Conference on Law and Economics. This third plenary session is moderated by Professor Subhashish Gangopadhyay. Professor Gangopadhyay is the Dean of the Indian School of Public Policy, founder and research director of the IDF. He graduated in economics from Presidency College, Kolkata, and received his PhD in economics from Cornell University, USA in 1983. And I'm sorry, for want of better audio clarity, I have decided not to switch on the audio due to network bandwidth. I apologize all the participants and dear professors and all other participants here. He was awarded a doctorate honoris causa by the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Besides being an advisor to the Finance Minister of the Government of India, Dr. Gangopadhyay has been a consultant on policies to various ministries, including finance, planning, industry, and rural development, etc. He has led important government research projects like the leading indicator of economic activity, the impact of steel decontrol on sale, the optimum use of Hajira Bijapur Jagdishpur gas pipeline, and on the exit policy as well. He is currently on the board of the International Development Enterprises India, IDEI, besides handling a number of significant policy advisory roles in India and abroad. I welcome Professor Subhashish Gangopadhyay on behalf of the Tamil Nadu National Law University and Indian Association of Law and Economics to the plenary session and to moderate this session. Welcome you, Professor.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Stefan White, Director, Institute of Law and Economics, University of Hamburg. The topic of his talk today is unconstitutional states of emergency. But before he starts, let me just introduce him to you. In addition to the current position he has, previously he had held positions or chairs at the Philipps University Marburg, the University of Kassel, the Ruhr University Bochum. He's also had a fellowship at the Weissenschafts College zu Berlin, a senior fellowship at the Krupp College in Greifswald, and a research fellowship in the Max Planck Institute of Economics in Jena. White's research focus is on institutional economics. He has a particular interest in the economic analysis of public law in general and constitutional law in particular. He has published textbooks in German and English in these fields. His particular research interest is the economic effects of judicial institutions and the economics of human rights. White has published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals, such as the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Journal of Development Economics, and the Journal of Comparative Economics. Currently, he is the co-editor of Constitutional Political Economy. He is a member of the editorial board of Public Choice and International Review of Law and Economics. He was born in Hamburg, Germany. Dr. Voigt, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk. I would have much preferred to be there in person. I've always liked to be in India. Some of you may know that there is this European Master in Law and Economics, of which Mumbai is a partner. So I've been in India on and off, also to other places. So thanks for being with the meeting this afternoon here in Germany. It's a Saturday morning. It's close to freezing. I hope you have a better weather than we do here. Let me start on the topic. So first of all, what's important is that it's not sort of my stuff alone. There's two co-authors here, Christian Bjørnskov, who is with the University of Aarhus in Denmark, that is a little north of us, and Mehdi Kesali, who's with me at the institute. And I'll try to be talking about unconstitutional states of emergency. Let me try to motivate the topic a little bit. As you may know, states of emergency are declared very often. If we just look at the current pandemic, so this is a period of 18, 20, 22 months, at least 99 countries have declared a state of emergency at least once. That is roughly every second country in the world. Now, states of emergency have a number of implications. The two most important of which I'm trying to flag in the slide, namely, on the one hand, they imply more powers to the executive, which basically means less powers to the legislature and or the judiciary. And they also imply fewer rights for citizens. Now, in previous research, Christian and I, my colleague from Denmark, we've been concerned with the determinants of having constitutionalized emergency provisions, and we refer to them as emergency constitutions. So don't look for an extra document called the emergency constitutions. This doesn't exist. What we have in mind when we talk about emergency constitutions are those parts of a country's constitution that refer to a state of emergency, the conditions for being called, the extra powers that a government enjoys under a state of emergency, and so on. Okay, so we've looked at the determinants of having sort of such provisions in a constitution. We have secondly looked at the reasons for declaring a state of emergency, which is obviously not the same thing. If you have the provisions, you never need to use them. And thirdly, we've been concerned with the consequences that materialize once a state of emergency has been declared. Let me give you a little bit of background, because I know not everybody has been working on the topic of states of emergency. So this is basically a graph that shows you the number of countries that have had emergency constitutions ever since 1850. So what you see is, post 1950, there was a significant increase in the number of countries that passed such provisions. Now you might say, wait a minute. But after 1950, also the number of sovereign countries increased. So this might make more sense because it shows you the proportion of all countries, of all sovereign states that have an emergency constitution. So what we see is that there is still a significant rise after 1950, and today some 90% of all countries have specific provisions dealing with emergencies in their constitution. Okay. Now, what about the reasons, the motives that can be used to justify calling a state of emergency? So the question here was a little bit: has it become more difficult or easier to call a state of emergency? And what we did here is, to compare the emergency constitutions that were in place in 1950 with those that were in place in 2011. And what you see is that in most cases, the number that you see has increased. So what does this mean? It means that in 1950, of all countries that had an emergency constitution, around 32% mentioned war/aggression as a possible reason to call a state of emergency. Okay, and this rose to almost half of all countries in 2011. And we can go through all the topics here. What you see is, so the message of the slide, I guess, is pretty clear. Namely, it has become easier to call a state of emergency, at least based on the events justifying its declaration. Yeah, we are economists, so we like to operationalize things, to code things. So this is our approach of coding emergency provisions. We call this the index of emergency powers, consisting of 6 variables. And we basically look at 3 cost components and 3 benefit components. So the cost components are basically, how difficult is it to declare a state of emergency? How many veto players basically need to agree to its declaration? Okay, and then we have the benefit components, and the benefit components are always from the point of view of the executive. How much additional competences does it get? Is it allowed to postpone elections? Is it allowed to to contain basic human rights? Is it allowed to restrict freedom of the press, etc.? Okay, and we code all this between 0 and 1, and 1 basically indicates an essentially unconstrained executive. So 0 would mean that there's no additional benefits and it's sort of costly, and 1 would obviously mean the opposite. Yeah, just as an observation, we were sort of amazed to see this. There's actually no substantial differences in index values between democracies and non-democracies. So in other words, in terms of their constitution, in terms of their de jure law, there is not much of a difference between democracies and autocracies. Just to give you an impression of the development of this index, this overall index value over the last 6 decades, what you see here is that the index value has increased, implying that the executive has been allocated more power compared to the amount of power it was basically allocated back in the 50s. And just to, here in Europe, we talk a lot about Hungary, democratic backsliding, etc., etc. Hungary passed a new constitution 10 years ago and has an INEP value of 0.71, basically indicating that the prime minister of Hungary really has immense power should he, it's always been a he, should he decide to declare a state of emergency. So this is just as a way of background, so you have some idea of what we are talking about. Here are some results on the determinants of declaring a state of emergency. Why would a government declare? The first finding is that it's crucial to distinguish between natural disasters and political turmoil. It makes a difference whether there is a tsunami or an earthquake, or whether there is mass demonstrations and general strikes. Higher levels of domestic conflicts, such as general strikes or protests, demonstrations, etc., increase the likelihood of calling a state of emergency based on these things. Yeah. Parliamentary governments are less likely to declare than presidential ones, so form of government does matter. Then the line in red, so to speak, the less costly it is for government to declare a state of emergency, the more likely it is to do so. So in other words, sort of the economic consideration, the economic analysis of this part of constitutional law does matter. If it's easier for government to declare, well, they are more likely to do so. Just a word on the consequences of declaring a state of emergency. Here, we thought it important to distinguish between natural disasters and political turmoil, not only due to the finding that I just reported, but also due to the degree of endogeneity, right? I mean, the effects of natural disasters are not entirely endogenous, but the occurrence itself, whether a tsunami, an earthquake, a volcano outbreak occurs, is pretty exogenous, okay? So we have fewer issues with endogeneity here. And we found a really strange result. When we control for the size of a disaster by controlling for the number of people who are affected by it, we find that if there is more benefits to the government when it declares a state of emergency, more people tend to die as a consequence of a natural disaster. This seems to be indicating that emergency powers are not used very wisely, to say it very carefully. This is definitely sort of an unexpected result. We then went on to do the same thing with regard to terrorist events. And in fact, we have 2 papers, one focusing on the Western world and one focusing on the Muslim world, because most terrorist incidents, relatively speaking, happen in the countries that are a member of the Organization of Islamic Countries, which is a second paper. And yeah, just a couple of results here. More government powers under this index of emergency powers are correlated with more incidents. So in other words, it seems that you cannot prevent terrorist incidents from happening by installing your government with additional powers. And sort of one potential reason behind this might be that in case there are small minority groups that of which some members are preparing an event. What you want is what you need as a state is that you have some neighbors, friends, etc., who report to the police. But if basic human rights basically are not respected with regard to these minority groups, and they are even less respected as a consequence of the state of emergency, and the likelihood that these people will report will be lower, such that the likelihood of a terrorist event being carried out increases. Interestingly, this holds for democracies only, so that's with regard to the first paper and not so with regard to the second paper. High levels of civil society are correlated with lower likelihood to suffer from terrorist events. So it seems that civil society organizations basically can be a mediating factor between the interests of some groups and the government level, which sort of might lead to these demands expressed in more peaceful fashions than by terrorist events. Lastly, that's the very bottom here for people interested in public choice issues. It's interesting to see that a declaration is less likely, a declaration of a state of emergency is less likely in election years. So this seems to indicate that politicians believe the declaration of a state of emergency to be unpopular. Otherwise, they would not hesitate to declare as many states of emergency in election years as in non-election years. So let me quickly try to summarize this and then get to my real topic. So we've seen that 90% of all countries have emergency provisions, that they are frequently invoked, and that they do channel government behavior, although not always in the intended direction, right? I mean, more people dying if governments have more competences. So until now, the implicit assumption has been that governments abide by the constraints fixed in the emergency constitution. And here we ask, is that really the case? Do they really abide by the constitutional provisions? Okay. More specifically, we ask, under what conditions are emergency constitutions likely or unlikely to be complied with? Okay. So let me try to structure the issue a little bit. This is going to be fairly quick and straightforward, I believe. So we think of three ways in which governments can behave unconstitutionally with regard to a state of emergency. So the first one is to simply declare it in an unlawful fashion. Okay, so you need the consent of a second chamber, and you don't care, you don't ask for it, or you need the signature of a president of a country, and you declare without having that signature. So that's an unlawful declaration. Then there might be an unlawful implementation. The Constitution says budgetary constraints, or the Parliament-approved budget, it needs to be complied with in all cases, and the government starts to overspend. Then this would be an unlawful implementation. This is an example for an unlawful implementation. And finally, unlawful prolongation. So in most constitutions, there is a maximum length of states of emergency that's defined. You might know in Roman times, 2,000 years ago, after 6 months, the dictator was out automatically. Okay, so after 6 months, the state of emergency was over. And most modern constitutions have similar rules, 6 months or 3 months, etc. And then there are rules for how it could be prolonged. But obviously, there might be cases in which a state of emergency has been declared. It should be over after 6 months. It's never prolonged, but it always goes on. Okay, so this is what we would refer to as the third possibility of behaving unconstitutionally under a state of emergency. Now, I hesitate to call this theory or hypotheses, so I just call it our expectations. In a sense, I assume it's pretty straightforward hypotheses here. So, firstly, we expect executives that are not complying with constitutional constraints during normal times, during non-state of emergency times, to be less likely to comply with constitutional constraints under states of emergency. So then, in a sense, the basic question would be, so why are they declaring a state of emergency in the first place? I mean, if they are not complying with constitutional constraints at all, or in normal times, why should they then? And the answer could be, well, it might give them an aura of additional legitimacy that might be international recognition, aspects like that. So that it seems to be a possibility. Secondly, although we didn't really spot any differences with regard to constitutional text, and very few with regard to behavior using these constitutions, in this case we would expect that autocrats are less likely to comply than democracies. Autocrats are basically are subject to fewer constraints, so they might be more willing to overstep constitutional constraints. Poor countries, I guess that's pretty straightforward. Recession-prone countries, these are not really hypotheses here. It's just our expectations. Recession-prone countries, why is that? Well, if a large chunk of the population basically suffers from a recession, it might be more willing. It might sort of use this as a focal point. More willing to demonstrate against government, which makes the survival of government in office less likely, which in turn might induce government to overstep the constitution simply to remain in power. Okay, so it's a pure power expectation, if you want. Then domestic turmoil rather than natural disaster is associated with unconstitutional emergencies. This follows a little bit from our previous findings, but in a sense, it's not crystal clear. To be honest with you, one could also expect exactly the opposite. So if it's true that states of emergency are unpopular, then declaring a state of emergency as a consequence of domestic turmoil might, in a sense, be more unpopular than declaring it as a consequence of a natural disaster. A government could say, hey, there's a volcano outbreak, we need to do something. Whereas if they say, well, there's all these demonstrations going on, we need to do something as well, yeah, raise the minimum wage or whatever. Okay, so because natural disasters are clearly more exogenous than domestic turmoil, it might be that the acceptance of government declaring a state of emergency is higher in the general population with regard to natural disasters and with regard to domestic turmoil. But we'll see what the data says. And then obviously we have our ENAP indicators here. A high cost ENAP is expected to go along with high unlawfulness, a high benefit ENAP with low unlawfulness. So if you get lots of additional benefits, well, then you might not need to overstep the Constitution in a sense. Okay, so those are our expectations. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge obviously is the data. All right, so what do we need? First of all, we need to establish a list of all states of emergency that have been declared on the nation state level. So we don't refer to subnational emergencies. If you're familiar with the US, there's always some state of emergency going on in the US in some county due to water flooding or lead in their water system or the drug epidemic or whatever. So we're not concerned with those. Otherwise, we'd have so many observations. So we are only concerned with them on the nation state level. Secondly, what we need to do, now we have this huge bunch or sample of states of emergency. Now we need to divide them. We need to separate the lawful from the unlawful ones. And then, as a third step, we need to inquire into the determinants of the unlawful ones. So this is about this is how we went about in producing the paper. So how did we do it exactly? We basically rely on a list of states of emergencies that's contained in a paper that was published some 10 years ago. We updated that paper for a number of years, and we also modified it. There actually were some states of emergency mentioned that we could not get any documents for, so we kicked them out. We have no clue how they got in there. So we believe we have a pretty elaborate list of states of emergencies. So now the separation issue is very difficult. right? What we did is actually we went to Factiva and LexisNexis and searched for the term state of emergency and unlawful. And then we got a couple of answers, and we checked this in addition with reports from a number of NGOs, and in particular from Freedom House. So these, Freedom House, New York-based NGO, has an annual report that basically has a paragraph on most countries, and we would check there if they describe a state of emergency as being unconstitutional. And well, I assume there might be some discussion about this later on. I was asked by actually a lawyer from a colleague from Harvard Law School. So this is overly broad. This is overly broad because obviously it could also be journalists and legal experts. It's not only courts that come in. And so he was basically asking, so how come you are taking into consideration judgments by non-local courts? And the answer is, well, because courts are not always independent from government, in particular with important and decisive issues such as legality or the constitutionality of declaring a state of emergency. Okay. And then lastly, we also were seeking reports on the prolongation of states of emergency. Okay. So this is what we did. What we get is this. We find out of 853 emergencies that are nicely documented between 1945 and 2017, we find that 115 might have been or are or were unlawful. And just one word on the data set. Now, being part of Factiva and LexisNexis basically means that there must have been newspaper reports on a particular event, in this case, a state of emergency. Now, this implies that, and mostly it's English-speaking newspapers that are being referenced. So this implies two things. First of all, the global South might be underrepresented because, there will be fewer. The likelihood of a report of a state of emergency in a very small African state is supposedly lower than a report on France or Spain. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is we observe that pre-1990 really, the number of reported states of emergency is a lot lower than post-1990. And we don't believe that this has anything to do with the transition in Europe. It's just that the degree of digitization of newspapers pre-1990 is a lot scarcer than post-1990. So in all likelihood, we are underestimating the number of unlawful emergencies. Here's a bit of an overview, so you get some feeling for what for how for the distribution sort of our emergencies. What you see is a distinction between democracies and autocracies on the one dimension, and the other dimension, a distinction between natural disaster and domestic turmoil. And what you see is the number in parentheses is the number of unlawful ones, and the number before is the overall number. So what you see is that in democracies, the likelihood of a natural disaster leading to an unlawful state of emergency is fairly low, 8 out of 271. Compare that to domestic turmoil. There, the number is 41 out of 241. So in democracies, the likelihood of an unconstitutional state of emergency following a domestic turmoil is a lot higher than compared to natural disasters. And this is even more pronounced with regard to autocracies. This is a little more detailed. This is distinguishing the three phases, the calling, the implementation, and the prolongation phase. Again, making the distinction between natural disaster and political turmoil on the one hand, and then, making the distinction between democracies and autocracies. Just one number that I want to flag, basically referring to phase 3 here. The average duration of constitutional versus unconstitutional state of emergencies is quite interesting. So in under constitutional ones, it's on average declared for 115 days, versus the unconstitutional ones on average pretty much exactly twice as long. Yeah, and then I might want to flag that 97 out of 115 unconstitutional states of emergency are based on political turmoil. So it seems to be that political turmoil is a lot more relevant here than our natural disasters. Now, to the econometric part of my presentation, we need to be careful not to sort of claim that we found any causal inference here. The structure, the data has fairly little structure. Obviously, there is major endogeneity concerns with regard to political turmoil, right? I mean, usually demonstrations, strikes, assassination attempts, they are all a reaction to government behavior. So it's clearly endogenous. Governments behaving, planning, considering whatever to behave unconstitutionally might also never call a state of emergency. We were thinking about using sort of Hackman two-step models here to resolve some of these issues. For doing so, we simply do not have enough observations. And secondly, there's also some state of emergencies that are declared without us being able to identify a triggering event. So the first stage of the Hackman would be sort of difficult if there's neither political turmoil nor a natural disaster. So we basically rely on simple techniques and try at least to refrain from causal claims. So long story short, here are our main results for the full sample. So this is democracies and autocracies, it's natural disasters, and political turmoil all in one. And what you see is that, and it's the likelihood of declaring a state of emergency that we consider to be unconstitutional, okay? So what you see is that the richer a country, the lower that likelihood, that's the first row here. Democracies are also significantly less likely to have an unconstitutional state of emergency. You know, when relying on odds ratios, we see that likelihood of a democracy declaring an unconstitutional state of emergency is only 75% of the likelihood of an autocracy declaring such a state of emergency. Now, these two results might also be somewhat interesting, and the last one down here. So presidential systems compared to parliamentary ones are more likely to experience unconstitutional states of emergency. And I want to flag this result here, the bicameral stuff. So in a sense, and that's going to be a recurring result. I can flag that already. So bicameral systems usually require both chambers of parliament to consent to a state of emergency. Now this drives up the cost of declaring a state of emergency, since it makes it more difficult to do so. And this seems to be sort of the cause really for why bicameral systems are correlated with a higher likelihood of unconstitutional states of emergency, because at the time executives basically want to just circumvent the second chamber. We have that down here again. This is not the existence of a second chamber, but it's if the second chamber really needs to approve. And as you can see, the coefficient is a bit larger, and it's being estimated a little more precisely. Let me go on to domestic events only. Remember, this is 97 out of 115 events.
Stefan,
yep.
I'm sorry for disturbing you, but we have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll be
if
done.
If you want to entertain some questions, you may.
Yeah,
want
I'll
to
be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know. I'll be done in a minute. So this in essence is are a very similar results. Let me quickly look at democracies only. Now income is insignificant, so it seems that being a democracy or not is really decisive. It's not how rich you are, at least as long as you are a democracy. And here you see, in addition to, let me just flag this, executive respect. So this is basically a variable that controls for the degree to which government has been respecting the Constitution all along, before having declared a state of emergency, okay? So if it has been in high respect of the Constitution, the likelihood of an unlawful state of emergency is lower, significantly lower, just as expected. And what else did I want to show you? Yeah, benefit INEP here is a negative, has a negative coefficient. So in other words, if the Constitution promises lots and lots of additional benefits, the government can do many additional things under a state of emergency, well, then the need to go beyond the constraints of the Constitution seems to be lower. And that's why we see a negative coefficient here. Yeah, I guess in the interest of time, I will not do an explicit set of conclusions, but just stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a very interesting, really interesting question that you have posed. First, let me get to the audience. Are there any questions? If you have, please turn on your mic. Okay, there is a question I just saw. Who was that?
I saw a question in the chat.
Was it in the chat box?
That by Dr. Felix.
Okay, there you are. Professor, I need a clarification with regard to INEP's methodology.
Yeah.
6 variables were used to. Can you read that?
Yeah, I quickly saw it already. Okay, so okay. What we do is we have 6 variables. Let me try if I can remember them by now. So 3 of them relate to the difficulty of declaring. Okay, so who has the power to declare, who needs to consent to declare, and on what basis, the events, the possible events, triggering events slide that I showed you, what are the grounds on which a state of emergency can be declared. So the assumption is the more difficult it is, the less likely a state of emergency will be declared. And essentially, what we do is we code these variables, also the benefit variables between 0 and 1, and then we add them up to have a cost INEP and a benefit INEP. And as you saw, we can at times we use single variables, like the second chamber needs to approve variable. That is one of the cost variables that is part of the cost INEP. Okay, and the benefit INEP is what was it? The right to postpone elections, the right to seize private property, to manage the consequences of an emergency, to constrain some basic rights, freedom to associate, etc., and also to restrict media freedom. I think those were the ones that are in the benefit INEP.
Stefan, I have a question for you. You clearly mentioned 3 different types. I thought there were 3 different ones, right? 2 you have already distinguished: natural disasters and political turmoil, right? That political turmoil being more endogenous than national disasters. It could be purely external shocks, right? And how you respond to them. Also, terrorism. I think terrorism should also be viewed differently. No? Well, because it is endogenous in the way you said it. But whereas political turmoil can probably be prevented by threat, terrorism, it's not that easy to prevent it by threat.
I see the point, and actually we have two papers on terrorism. One in Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the other one in the Journal of Peace Research, and there we only look at terrorism. Okay, so we don't combine it with mass demonstrations or assassination, single assassination attempts. We just look at terrorist events and rely on, you probably now want to know where we get the data from. There's sort of an established database of terrorist events that sort of is the standard in terrorism research. Actually, at the beginning, we've been working on this project for a number of years now. At the beginning, we had a three-partite division. Namely, and as Indians, I think you're very well aware of this. Domestic turmoil basically is the consequence of some sort of collective action. There's demonstrations, strikes, etc. But there might also be emergencies that are caused by industries. If a factory blows up and destroys, there might, you might have a chemical factory that destroys a whole area, and that leads to the death of many people. So we were thinking of this as a third category. Yet again, there are not so many observations. So saying anything sort of more systematic seemed to be more challenging, which is why we haven't really looked into this third category of emergencies yet.
Okay, we have 3 minutes, so maybe one last question. There is somebody called Ranita Nagar who has asked you, I don't know if you really said this, but who mentions that you said right-wing governments are less likely to suffer. Please explain.
Oh, okay, so this this is with regard to terrorism. So what we in the Western world. So what we did actually there is we looked at the ideological leaning of the government in place, and it seems that this is conservative and liberal in the classical European sense. Governments suffering from or experiencing a terrorist event. So it seems that right-wing or liberal governments in that sense are less likely to experience a terrorist event. At the same time, once they do, they are more likely to declare a state of emergency. Okay, so those were the two findings with regard to the ideological leaning of governments with regard to terrorist events. Okay, this is not any kind of general finding. This was with regard to terrorism.
Okay.
I don't know where the chat stayed. I thought there was something more on the chat, but
there's one more.
Yeah.
No, but which essentially says that the variables that you talked about, right? They have a lot of subjectivity involved in them.
Well,
inept variables.
Yeah. Well, with so maybe explain how we did it. It could be the case that you wouldn't agree on all of these cases, but so we relied on this huge data set. The Comparative Constitutions Project. This is Zach Elkins and Tom Ginsberg. They produced a book that appeared in 2009, The Endurance of Constitutions, which appeared with Cambridge University Press, I believe. So they have this huge data set, and comprising something like close to 700 different variables. Having coded all aspects of constitutions, and they do this on an annual basis. Okay. And this is essentially where we get our data from, and also most of our coding. So in a sense, you can challenge the coding of the CCP coders, which at times we have done, and then they have changed their coding if they agreed. But essentially, it's not as subjective as it might appear right now. If you're into empirical research regarding constitutions, you're most likely to be familiar with that data set, and it's the, I wouldn't say it's the gold standard, but it's the most frequently used data set in this area.
Okay, thank you very much. It's exactly 3 o'clock, so we have to compliment Stefan White. I do hope I got the pronunciation of your last name right.
That's the American way. John Voigt, I guess.
Yes, of course.
We pronounce it Vogt, but it doesn't matter. It's fine. I'm used to it.
I should have asked you. I should have asked you
It's
before
okay.
I introduced.
Don't worry.
Sorry for that. Sorry for that. So thank you very much. It was I found it extremely interesting, especially because if we look around us, there has been an erosion of democratic principles in almost every country. And the pandemic certainly brought it to the fore, but hints of that happening were already there even before the pandemic. So the pandemic has really forced us to look at it more closely. So in that context, this is an extremely, extremely topical research that you're doing. And I'll definitely follow your work now. Some of the things that you mentioned looked very intriguing to me. So thank you very much for keeping to the time and giving us this wonderful presentation, which, as I said, is extremely topical and should affect all of us if we could find the right way to proceed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all the best for the remaining parts of your conference. And of course, stay negative.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.